Aloha. I'm United States Congressman Ed Case, reporting to you from Washington, D.C. I'm reporting to you as your representative from the 1st Congressional District in Hawaii. This is actually my third tour of duty in Washington, D.C. on behalf of our Hawaii. My first tour started when I was age 22 when I went to work for United States Representative and later United States Senator Spark Matsunaga as a very young legislative assistant. I spent 2.5, 3 years with Spark right here on Capitol Hill. And of course, coming back now to represent the same district that Spark represented many years ago is an amazing feeling to have that obligation, the obligation that I started with through him when I was 22 years old. As you know, I then went back to Hawaii, practiced law, and served in the state legislature. And then I came back for my second tour of duty in 2002 when I was elected to take over for the legendary United States Representative Patsy Mink in a special election. And Patsy Mink represented Hawaii's second congressional district. That is really the windward side of Oahu up through the North Shore and down into Wahiawa and the Waianae Coast, and then all of the other islands. And so that was my responsibility, my kuleana, for 4+ years. So 2 full terms plus a little bit of a third term. Now again, I start another third tour here in Washington, D.C., having been elected for a full term to represent Hawaii's 1st Congressional District, which is really the city of Honolulu. The incredible 1st Congressional District starts on the east at Makapu'u Point, runs all the way through East Honolulu, so Kuli'o'o, Niu, Ainahaina, Kaimuki, Waikiki, Mo'ili'ili, Mekali, all of the valleys, Manoa, Nu'uanu, the heights, Makiki Heights, Pacific Heights, and then rolls down through central Honolulu downtown into Kalihi, Mapunapuna, and then out through Salt Lake, Aliamanu, Pearl Harbor, all of the communities along the coast there right above Pearl Harbor, Pearl City, and then it rolls up towards the central Oahu, goes up as far as Mililani, and Mililani Mauka is the northernmost point of the district, then comes back down through Waikele, Waipahu, Ewa Beach, Kapolei, the amazing new communities of Kapolei and Ewa through Honokaihale to Ko'olina, and then it ends at Kahe Point. So it is really the leeward side of the island of Oahu, urban Honolulu, the center of urban Honolulu, but also, of course, part of the suburbs of East Honolulu, as well as the suburbs of Ewa Beach and Kapolei, where the growth in our state is really occurring. So it is a little bit of a different district than the one that I represented the last time when I represented my own home of the Big Island of Hawaii, where I was born and raised in Hilo. But you know, one thing about representing Hawaii in the United States House of Representatives, of course, we have 2 United States representatives and 2 United States senators. And my colleague Tulsi Gabbard represents Hawaii District 2 at the moment, the one that I previously represented. But you know, one thing about representing Hawaii in Congress, and this goes back to the days when I worked for Spark Matsunaga, when Spark was representing the 1st and Patsy Mink was representing the 2nd Congressional. We really don't care too much about that boundary line that's along the top of the Ko'olau and down into Wahiawa. I mean, you know, we all are responsible. We all know that Hawaii is a very interlinked state. We all know that what happens in Honolulu affects the rest of the state and vice versa. And so, you know, for all intents and purposes, I think we all have always believed, those of us that have represented Hawaii in the United States House of Representatives, that we really do represent the entire state. We have a special obligation to our district, but we really represent the entire state. So I don't distinguish between whether somebody comes to me asking for help or an issue that needs to be addressed or an observation or a question as to whether they're in the 1st or 2nd. We just try to serve everybody. So the district that I represent, of course, is half the state. That's how that works. We have 2 representatives, and so we split it up half the state. So I directly represent about 700,000 residents of Hawaii in the United States House of Representatives, and indirectly twice as many. And so it is an incredible responsibility. It is an incredible district from a sheer diversity perspective. I mean, you think about all of our ethnic diversity throughout the 1st Congressional, There are a couple of things that are particularly unique about the 1st Congressional nationally. It is one of the largest districts in terms of residents and citizens who were not born United States citizens. They emigrated, they earned their citizenship. It's one of the very largest in our entire country. It is the largest in population for many of the ethnic groups. For example, our Filipino American community, Hawaii #1 and Hawaii #2 are the top two districts throughout 435 representative districts throughout our country in terms of the number of Phil-Ams that live and work and have families in the 1st and the 2nd Congressional. The same is true of our veterans. We have one of the highest veteran populations in the entire country, the highest per capita number, so somewhere around 10% plus, which is much higher than the national average. So, you know, although it is an incredible district that is in many ways like many other districts throughout our country, especially urban districts, because it is primarily an urban district, although it has many of the same concerns as such districts, affordable housing would be one, trying to be sure that you know, the crime rate is a very minimal crime rate is one area. Yet there is so much diversity that makes it so much different from other districts throughout our country. And so I always say that one of my jobs here in Washington, having been born and raised in Hawaii, but yet having now worked on Capitol Hill for 8 years at this point, one of my jobs is explaining Washington to Hawaii and explaining Hawaii to Washington. I call that cultural translation, an important part of my job. But I love the fact that I am representing Hawaii 1 all over again. I'm proud of it. But the challenges are great and the needs are great, and my job is to try to get the job done for Hawaii here in Washington. This is one of my first reports back to you. I hope to do this very frequently throughout my term, and I have a 2-year term, so I will be your United States representative until early January of 2021. So it seems like a long time, but it sure goes by fast. We're only about 5 weeks into it at this point. And so much has already happened. But this is an opportunity for me to report back to you. I intend to do this frequently. I also intend to do this in person by going back and staying in touch with you and doing talk stories throughout our district as I did in my prior service. You know, let's start with a really basic question. What is my job as your United States representative? It's a pretty good question that you should ask me. What do I think my obligation is as your United States representative, your only United States representative? Well, I think there's 3 parts to my job. The first part of my job is that I have a constitutional obligation as a member of the United States Congress to act as a separate, independent, and co-equal branch of government. Separate, independent, and co-equal branch of government. That's what our Constitution says is the job of the United States Congress. It's one of our 3 branches of government, and it is not subservient to any of the other branches. It doesn't, it doesn't have to, have any other branch look down at us, and yet we are responsible for co-governing our country together with our executive branch, headed by our president, and our Supreme Court, headed by our justices and our Chief Justice. And we all have a role in this great country, and my role as a member of Congress is to act separately, to act independently, and to act co-equally. Separately meaning that I have a role to make my own independent decisions about what I think is right for our country, and to work with my colleagues to try to effectuate what we think is the right direction for our country. Independent because we are independent of any of the other branch. We have our own responsibility to this country. We don't have a responsibility to follow the Supreme Court or to follow the executive branch. Our responsibility is to provide our own opinions, our own guidance, and it is to act as a check and balance, especially on the executive branch, which is a very important part of our job, to oversee the executive branch, to say no to the executive branch where we think that the executive branch is going in the wrong direction, where our president is going in the wrong direction. Now, we have to do that as part of many voices in the United States Congress. That's how the system was set up. The president is in charge of the executive branch. We're in charge of the legislative branch. And the fact is that we have 435 of us voting on the House side and 100 more on the Senate side. So, you know, it takes a lot of work to work things out internally. Sometimes we simply disagree on things, and at that point it's time to vote in a situation where the majority rules in a vote. But mostly our job is to try to act as a separate, independent, and co-equal branch of government to chart the direction for our country. And so that's my first obligation. That's my constitutional obligation. My obligation is to be a national leader. And as I've always said, if any member of Congress doesn't feel that he or she is up to being a national leader, then shouldn't be in the job. And so my job is to have my own thoughts about the direction that our country should go in, to work with you to figure out what you think we should be doing for our country, and then to take what you think and what I think and try to mold it into working with my colleagues inside the legislative branch to go ahead and put forward good policy for our country, to put forward a good solid oversight of the executive branch when needed, and of course to react to the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court rules, as is its obligation, what is and is not constitutional, what does and doesn't meet our Constitution. So from that perspective, you know, frankly, I'm not much of a Supreme Court basher. I don't think that that is a healthy approach. I think the Supreme Court has its job. The Supreme Court rules. That's its obligation under our system. But if the Supreme Court says that something is unconstitutional, then the job of the legislative branch and the executive branch is to figure out, well, can we get to the same place by passing laws that are constitutional? So that's our role as a check and balance on the Supreme Court, that we in turn can try to chart another course that will actually get done what we want to get done. So that's the first part of my job. The second part of my job has been honored by a long and incredible string of senators and representatives before me, dating back to 1959 when we became a state. And of course, we're celebrating that anniversary you know, this year. And many, many legends of our congressional delegation, whether you want to start with, you know, Senator Daniel Inouye, or my old boss, Spark Matsunaga, or Hiram Fong, or Daniel Akaka, Cease Heftel, Patsy Mink, Pat Psyche, a whole range, Neil Abercrombie. We all believed that one part of our job for sure was to make sure that our federal government was working for Hawaii, that our federal government was getting the job for Hawaii, getting the job done for Hawaii. Now, you know, that's sometimes easier said than done, because sometimes we think, well, okay, our federal government is sitting here and, you know, we're passing these, you know, laws that are supposed to go out there and be applied, you know, to the states and to the other parts of our country, and we're passing appropriations and funding bills that are going to be applied in the right way to all parts of our country. But we all know back at home that we are in many ways different from the rest of the country. We are not like Idaho, for example, and we are not like Alabama, and we are not like Maine. Every state has its own unique circumstances, but we have very unique circumstances. You know, for one thing, we're sitting in the middle of the ocean, a long, long way away from Washington, D.C. And in all honesty, I can tell you from my experience in Washington, that although that there are very, very good meaning people within our federal government, especially the executive branch, they want to do the right thing by our laws, by our funding. Sometimes they just don't get Hawaii. And they do things that are mistakes in terms of how they are applied to Hawaii. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this, and some of these come from my prior service. I remember that when I was when I was serving the last time, I represented the island of Lanai. And one of the major issues that we have in Hawaii for our veterans is access to good, solid veterans medical care. One of the promises that we make to our folks that serve in the military is that we will help them with their medical care, and that takes a network of veterans hospitals and clinics throughout our country. And the idea is that when veterans need medical care, they can get to that quality medical care. Seems pretty basic, right? Of course, most of our medical care for veterans in Hawaii is still in Honolulu. And so what the Veterans Administration does is says, well, if veteran, if you want to get from wherever you live to where you can get that veterans care, we will reimburse you a certain amount. And that reimbursement is mostly calculated on driving to the nearest hospital or clinic. And so one day I got an email from a vet over on Lanai, and he said, hey, I'm having a real problem with my veterans benefits. They're not giving me an adequate reimbursement. Can you help out? So I contacted the Veterans Administration here and said, hey, what's the issue? My vet constituent can't get to the hospital. And they said, well, what's the problem? We're giving him the full reimbursement. And I said, well, what's your reimbursement based on? And he said, well, it's based on the standard mileage reimbursement. And I said, do you realize that Lanai is a different island than Oahu? He can't drive from Lanai to Oahu. Now that VA person understood immediately the mistake had been made, but they just didn't know. They didn't think about it. And so sometimes well-meaning policies here don't necessarily translate out to Hawaii. I remember another example of this, our Hawaiian language immersion programs, where we have children, in some cases, who grew up speaking Hawaiian. And there was a law that still, to some extent, remains in the books that says that you have to pass certain standardized national tests, but those tests are administered in English. And so I said to the Department of Education, hey, do you realize that you're asking folks who are just learning English possibly and who are being taught in Hawaiian to pass tests that have nothing really to do with their intelligence? They only have to do with their language competence at the moment. Well, that was corrected. And that was, again, a well-meaning person that just didn't really realize the particular situations we had in Hawaii. But those are some individual examples. On a larger example, the job of helping Hawaii comes down to trying to make sure that our federal programs and our federal funding are targeted to Hawaii. A couple of examples again. We have one of the most largest tourism industries in the entire country. And our tourism industry is 25–30% of our total economy, maybe more when you count all the indirect effects. It's the largest percentage of any state in our country that is devoted to tourism. So clearly, when we have federal funding that is devoted to tourism marketing, for example, which we do have, we have large amounts that are devoted to Brand USA tourism marketing. And those amounts should be allocated in a way that also assists Hawaii. So one of the items that we have to always work on is to be sure that Brand USA national marketing is covering Hawaii enough, fairly. Because a lot of the times this is just a fair allocation throughout the country to Hawaii. Certainly another area that we've always focused on in terms of our federal government helping out Hawaii is in the area of overall assistance to our military, which is one of our top economic drivers as well. Now this is both an obligation that I think we have to our country to be able to host our military in Hawaii, one of the most strategic places in the entire world for our military, but also, of course, as we help our military in Hawaii, we're helping ourselves because of the economic impacts of the military in Hawaii. And so the challenge there is to make sure that federal programs, federal dollars, are assisting our military in a way that help our military in Hawaii itself. One of the areas would be, for example, military housing, a good solid housing for our troops, a good solid housing for our troops and their families, so when our service members are stationed overseas, their families are in a comfortable place back home and our service members are not worrying about them. This came up for me in a hearing just yesterday that I'll discuss a little bit further. So the challenge of the number two part of my job is to make sure that Hawaii is getting its fair share from our federal government of various programs that our federal government runs, and that as our federal government administers these programs, it does so in a way that actually fits Hawaii's unique circumstances and Hawaii's unique needs. And that takes a lot of work, a lot of interaction with the folks back home, to make sure we understand where the issues are, and it takes a lot of interaction back here inside of the federal government. Now it's not as glamorous as, you know, standing up on the floor of the United States House giving a floor speech on some matter of national policy, or being in a very hot committee hearing on a major issue where that people feel strongly about. But it is really the nuts and bolts of helping Hawaii here in Washington is knowing how to work the system, if I can put it that way, both within the legislature but also in our executive branch, to try to know where to go to get a problem fixed within the executive branch. The third part of my job is helping you with your individual needs. And we sometimes call this casework, so it's kind of like a lawyer or a doctor. Somebody comes in to ask you for help, and you open a case on their behalf. That's why it's called casework. It has nothing to do with me. It was used a long time ago, and that's the common usage in Washington for what I'm describing. And that can come in all shapes and forms. And you know, this is a lesson I really learned from Spark Matsunaga, again, going back to a 22-year-old, very, very young legislative assistant in his office, because Spark understood that these were the three parts of his job. He understood his role as a national leader. He understood perfectly his role to help Hawaii in the federal government. But he also understood one thing, and I remember he told me and us other young, impressionable staff folks one time, he said, you know, most folks, they pay their taxes all their lives, and they trust their government to do the right thing, and they hope their government does the right thing, and they vote. But they really have no real contact with their federal government other than writing a check once a year, or more than once a year in some cases. And he said, you know, but every once in a while, a person will need some help. Every once in a while, a person will have a question that needs somebody to advocate for that question or for that concern inside our federal government. And when somebody asks, possibly for the first and only time in their life, we want to be there to try to help them. We want to be there to help them solve their problem with their federal government. Now, this can come in a lot of shapes and forms, as I said earlier, but there are some areas that are pretty common when you come into the area of so-called casework. If you want to take a look at the largest categories of casework really in my office, and I think this is true of many offices, but perhaps more in Hawaii in some of these areas, the largest is assistance with immigration. Because again, as I said earlier, many of us and our families are immigrants. That we were born overseas and naturalized U.S. citizens, and in many cases we have family that are back in other countries. The Philippines would be a primary area, but not just the Philippines. This is true, for example, with Vietnam, certainly with all of the countries of the Asia Pacific, but not again exclusively to the Asia Pacific, because we have many ethnicities now living with us. We have some cases, for example, that come from folks that immigrated from Brazil, as just an example. These are prior cases. In that case, because our immigration system, rightly, I believe, is oriented towards family reunification. So, in other words, if a husband is naturalized as an American citizen, that his spouse and that his children should be able to come as well. In some cases, his father and mother to be cared for in their old age. The process can be very slow, as anybody that's gone through it knows. And it's really one of the tragedies, I think, of our immigration system today, that it just takes too long for folks to be able to come into our country legally. But in those cases, sometimes it just takes way too long, and our job is to move the process along. Sometimes our job is to simply figure out where the process stands, because some of these immigration, naturalization, or green card applications, they can take years, actually sometimes decades of waiting on a waiting list, which is ridiculous when you think about it. But at least what we can do is to try to find those answers and to move things along. We can't get the immigration folks to deviate from the law. I don't want to do that. I want everybody to be following the law, but we can get answers as to status. And sometimes where there are judgment calls to be made, we can advocate for folks on their individual immigration concerns. Another area would be Veterans Affairs. I spoke of one example of a veteran that I assisted the last time to indicate how Hawaii is unique. But certainly veterans benefits is an area that is especially relevant for many, many veterans in Hawaii. Again, one of the highest per capita numbers of veterans of anywhere, and sometimes with quite unique issues, quite unique problems. And our job again is to advocate for the vet and his or her family within the Veterans Administration or otherwise, to find out what the status is of claims. Again, not to ask the Veterans Affairs to deviate from the law or from their procedures, but to treat everybody fairly, treat everybody in a timely manner, and where there are judgments to be made, to try to assist the veteran with his or her needs. I'll give you an example of this from my last service. Again, I expect that I'll have many examples from my current service once we get into the full swing of casework. But this is an area that I'll always remember, because I think this exemplifies what one can do as a member of Congress for one's constituents. The veterans' benefits are available, of course. Disability benefits are available to those who have suffered severe medical conditions as a result of their service. And of course, we have seen this, especially in our last almost 20 years of active combat around the globe, especially with not only physical disabilities, but also disabilities that are not directly physical, not directly manifested, for example, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And what we know about PTSD is that it can be crippling to our veterans, and that it cannot, that sometimes it takes a very, very long time to manifest. So in other words, maybe you don't quite know you have it. Maybe it comes at you after a long period of time. Maybe you didn't seek treatment right away, and at some point it becomes overwhelming and disabling. And in that case, a veteran is entitled to disability benefits by law. Sometimes the link between the service and the PTSD can be quite long. And in those cases, oftentimes what the Veterans Administration wants is a person that was with you on the battlefield, for example, when you suffered the event that later caused the PTSD, to attest that you were there. Now, that might be a little bit more easy if it just happened 2 or 3 years ago, but imagine that it happened decades ago. And we had a case where we had a veteran who served in, as I recall, it was the Korean War, so a long, long time ago. And he had never gotten treatment. Maybe they didn't really know what PTSD was then. They called it by a different name. They didn't understand it quite the same medically. And he came to us for help. He said, hey, you know, I've gone to the doctor. The doctor has said that I have quite delayed PTSD. It's disabling. And the Veterans Administration denies benefits for me. And we said, well, what's the issue? And they said, they say that I cannot prove that the event was caused by something on the battlefield, which is where it actually was caused in his case. And so our role in my office was to go out and find his buddies, to find the folks that he served with and to try to locate them wherever they were throughout the country. You can imagine a couple of decades later that's not quite hard to do, but we had the records and we found them, and they attested to the events that he claimed did happen, and he got his disability benefits. Now, I'm proud of that. Now, again, it's not, speaking on a major piece of legislation or, having my name on a bill that goes through Congress. It's not about, finding $50 million for Hawaii for a particular project, but it is about helping one person, and that's part of my job to do that. A lot of the work that I do in Congress is in committees. You can imagine that with 435 members of the U.S. House and with many, many areas of our United States government, ranging from Veterans Affairs to education, to housing, to taxes, to any number of things, immigration we've talked about, everything our federal government does. Everything our federal government does is subject to laws passed by Congress and to oversight by Congress and to the check and balance responsibility of Congress on our administration. And so Congress doesn't act as kind of one big body and cover each and every one of those areas, at least at the beginning of the process. What we do is split up into committees. And so we have many, many committees in Congress. And your selection of committees at the beginning of any one of your terms is, of course, a very, very important decision, a very important opportunity to contribute not only to your country but to your state and to your constituents in a way that will help them the most. And so in this particular Congress, I was just really incredibly fortunate to be appointed to the Committee on Appropriations. The Committee on Appropriations is the oldest committee in the United States House of Representatives, and the basic reason is because it does one of the most major parts of government, which is that it decides where the federal spending will be devoted to. So how do we allocate federal spending? And we're talking about all federal discretionary spending. When we talk about discretionary, we mean with the exception of spending that happens automatically. For example, Social Security benefits. Congress doesn't appropriate that money every year. It just happens automatically out of the Social Security Trust Fund. Medicare is another example. But a lot of our federal government spending, a great deal of it, well over $1 trillion a year, is federal discretionary spending. And the Committee on Appropriations is responsible for deciding where that money is going to go. So you can imagine that not only is it an old and very historic committee, but it is highly coveted. It is one of what are called exclusive committees. These are 2 or 3 of the committees of Congress that are supposed to be of such great importance that you're not supposed to serve on any other committee, because your time, your effort, your energy should be devoted to that particular committee, unless you are requested to serve on another committee on a waiver basis, so waiving the rules. And so I was, again, very, very fortunate to be assigned to the Committee on Appropriations. There has been only one member of the United States House from Hawaii before me who has served on the Committee on Appropriations, and that was U.S. Representative Daniel Akaka when he served in the U.S. House. And he was last on the Appropriations Committee in, I recall, 1990. So it's been almost 30 years since a member of the House from Hawaii has served on appropriations. And so that was a very, I guess I would almost say it was a real game changer for me in terms of where my obligations were going to be devoted to, both nationally and for Hawaii. And clearly it's going to be in the Appropriations Committee. So that will give me the opportunity not only to make judgments as to where money should be devoted in our country, and of course as we devote monies we also prioritize the many, many efforts on behalf of our country, because if you have a program that doesn't have any money, then it's not going to get the job done, an authorized program. versus a program that is fully funded. That's obviously going to get the job done there. The Appropriations Committee also has subcommittees, and these are the Appropriations Committee's desire to allocate the responsibilities, even within the Appropriations Committee, over all of the departments of the federal government, so they can get down to some real specialization in those areas. And of course, with specialization comes the obligation and ability to exert expertise in those areas and to exert additional influence over where those monies are going to be devoted. And again, I think I was quite fortunate in the subcommittees that I was able to gain on the Appropriations Committee. One subcommittee has jurisdiction over all military construction and veterans affairs throughout our country. So my subcommittee on MILCON VA, as it's known, is responsible for deciding how we assist our military with its facilities. And that's not just, ports and barracks and that kind of stuff. That's about quality of life, really, for our service members. How do we provide good, solid housing? How do we provide child care? How do we provide safe communities for our military so that they will want to enlist and they will want to stay in? The Veterans Affairs side of that committee is critical from my perspective, especially for Hawaii, because although we have good, solid veterans services for the most part in Hawaii, we have gaps. We have clear gaps in terms of our hospitals and clinics, because as many know, in Hawaii we serve not only Hawaii from a veterans perspective, we really serve the entire Pacific veterans, and we have many veterans who live in places like Guam and even overseas in the Asia Pacific. So we have to pay very careful attention to how we fund and how we allocate programs for our veterans. So I'm looking forward to being able to influence that on that subcommittee. The other subcommittee I serve on is the Commerce, Science, and Justice Committee. And the Commerce Committee administers funding for all of the United States Department of Commerce. That's really critical, for example, to the promotion of Hawaii overseas. I talked earlier about tourism. That's a major part of our jurisdiction in that subcommittee. Also, the Commerce Committee is responsible for much of our oceans-related research throughout our country through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which has a major headquarters right in Honolulu, which really runs at Pearl Harbor, Ford Island. It's the Inoue National Center there, which runs oceanographic research really throughout Asia Pacific, the premier research in the world in that area. The science area is particularly important for being able to fund scientific research out of Hawaii. And here my focus will be on really in the many ways the world-class scientific research that's occurring at the University of Hawaii and elsewhere in Hawaii, especially in areas of great relevance to Hawaii. Astronomy is a perfect example where you have some of the premier astronomical facilities and related research in our entire world. That deserves support. I already spoke about the oceans. Some of our tropical medicine research is premier in the world, some of our tropical agricultural research. That can all be supported by federal funding, so I'm looking forward to utilizing that subcommittee for that purpose. The judiciary side of it, there really the focus is on access to justice. I've been a lawyer for almost 40 years now in Honolulu, and I know firsthand that although some have full access to justice, many do not. And that's not acceptable in our society. So the ability to be able to fully fund incredibly important agencies and efforts such as the Legal Services Administration, legal aid, is very important to me, and I hope to utilize that committee to that end. After I got appointed to Appropriations, I was asked, and this came as a bit of a surprise to me, but I was asked to serve also on the Committee on Natural Resources. And as you can tell from the name, the Committee on Natural Resources is responsible for oversight and for the programs for all of our natural resources throughout our country, so our national parks. our national monuments, our national historical sites, our heritage areas, really the resources that came to us from before we even were here, and of course also our national cemeteries. The National Cemetery of the Pacific would be one example of this. And so that committee was exciting because I had actually wanted to serve on that committee, and I'd put on a request to serve on it until I knew that I was going to be appointed to appropriations, and I wasn't expecting it, but I'm very, very happy with that committee as well, because it gives me the opportunity really to focus on Hawaii's incredible natural resources, whether they be land-based or ocean-based. I think, you know, we have inherited an incredible heritage that is frankly endangered. I don't think Hawaii is called the endangered species capital of the world without reason. And I think we have an obligation. And so this gives me the opportunity to try to work on areas that are of particular concern and importance to preserving our natural heritage in Hawaii and beyond. The Natural Resources Committee, which oversees the Department of the Interior, also has the obligation to oversee federal programs that affect our indigenous peoples throughout our country, so our Native Americans, Native Alaskans, and Native Hawaiians. And so the committee is responsible for Native Hawaiian affairs within our federal government. And again, like the Appropriations Committee, functions through subcommittees. And so the subcommittees that I was able to gain membership on are the Subcommittee on National Parks, also the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife, and then the Subcommittee on Indigenous Peoples. And going back a bit to the National Parks Subcommittee and National Monuments, one major effort that I hope to move along is the effort to designate, to fully develop and designate Honouliuli National Monument. This was a Japanese-American internment camp right on Oahu that was really forgotten to history until relatively recently. We think about the internment camps as being mainland, you know, California, Arizona, the western United States, and we forget that we committed this incredible national tragedy even right within Hawaii, where we interned our own. And Honouliuli was, again, really neglected and forgotten, but a very concerted effort has developed over the last decade plus. It actually started when I was last in Congress, when we actually got the designation started. And now it's time to finish the job, to actually turn it into a living and breathing historical site where folks can come to remember that we made this incredible mistake once, and to really commit to not making it ever again. So a very good set of committees that I'm happy to be able to work on. I want to talk now really with you about some of the national issues that I'm working on in this particular Congress. I've talked about kind of our district and how we fit into the national. I've talked about my job. I've talked about my committees. Now let me spend a little bit of time with you just talking about some of the compelling national issues that I think will be occupying and should occupy much of our time in the next couple of years, at least the next couple of years. As I tape this, which is early February still, we're not out of the woods on the federal government shutdown. As I tape this, we have ended the first shutdown, the longest shutdown in our history, but we're still up against a deadline of the possible continuation of this shutdown. Now, I certainly hope that by the time you view this, we'll be out of the woods on that. But it doesn't take away from the bottom line largest national challenge we have, one that drew me back into politics, drew me back into government, and that is, can we find a better way to govern our country? Can we find a better way forward to solve our problems? Because the divisiveness, the corrosiveness in Washington, the inability of the two sides to come together to form consensus solutions is really at the core of so many of the problems that we face with our country right now. And nothing illustrated this more than the federal government shutdown. Now, why the federal government and 800,000 plus federal workers and their families and many federal contractors should have been thrown out of work, should have been asked to stay on the job without pay for well over a month, almost a month and a half, because the parties could not come together to solve a pretty straightforward, complicated, but nonetheless solvable problem like border security, is an example of the problem and the challenge that we have in this country today. It should never have happened. That's absolutely no way to govern, and federal workers and their families and the federal government should not have been held hostage to that debate and to that outcome. So it never should have been linked up. And we have to be sure that that doesn't happen again. And I hope during the time between when we tape this and when you see this, we will have found a better way forward, at least for now, in that particular situation. You know, border security, I think we can all agree that we want to secure our borders. That's not the issue. And I think it's eminently solvable. I think we do need physical barriers on parts of our border that are especially passable where we need extra security. But I don't think we need it throughout the entire border. I don't think that passes a cost-benefit test. I think that there are much better ways to secure that border, whether it be technology or enhanced border personnel. And I don't think that the physical barrier will be particularly effective throughout the entire border. Now, I think that those are kind of mainstream solutions there that many of us can agree on if we get away from the mindset of, well, you know, our president said this thing and the Democratic leadership said that thing. If we can get out of that mindset where we're just going to 100% follow or oppose what one or the other side said, which I don't think is constructive at all for our country. If we can get to the merits of stuff, I think we can get them solved. So that's our largest national issue right there, is can we find a better way to govern? And I think we can. I think that folks across the country have said that they're disgusted with Washington. They're disgusted at the way Washington is working. And you know, they're tired of people yelling and screaming at each other and want people to sit down and talk with each other. I heard that on the campaign trail, and I've certainly heard it since I got into office. And those were my marching orders coming in here, try to get it done. And I can tell you that having spent 5-6 weeks now with my colleagues, both sides of the aisle, I think many people inside Congress feel the same way. There are some very encouraging areas of cross-aisle cooperation, whether they be formal caucuses or just informal discussions. Certainly, this border security issue will be a test of whether we can actually try to pull some of that stuff together. But this is an issue that's going to be with us for a while, and the sooner that we can cut through this and start to get to work again, the better. We can solve border security. Speaking of which, immigration reform is a huge issue for our country. We haven't reformed our immigration system in a generation. That's really that's how long it's been since we actually tried to say, how can we improve it? I think there's a couple of different parts to immigration reform. I think, first of all, we cannot simply turn a blind eye to illegal immigration. And I'll call it what it is. It is illegal immigration. If somebody comes into our country without a valid visa or without permission, or comes in on a visitor visa and overstays their permission, that's illegal. That's against our laws. And so I don't agree with the folks that want to call it something else. It's illegal immigration, and we do have to crack down on illegal immigration, because if we don't, we're just going to be back in the same soup in 20 or 30 years. I also think it's quite unfair to folks, many in Hawaii and their relatives back in the homelands, that have been waiting in line for 10 or 20 years. I think people that have waited in line to get in and did it the legal way, I can't imagine folks thinking, well, that's okay for somebody to come in illegally when I had to wait, 5, 10 or longer years, or I had to go through all of that heartache and hassle to get in. That needs to be fixed, clearly. But I do believe in immigration, and I do believe we need to increase legal immigration. I think immigration has been one of the strongest parts of our country and our heritage and our state. Of course, we know in Hawaii, that's an incredibly strong part of Hawaii. And I want legal immigration to continue and to increase and to have that diversity of immigration, those new ideas, those new thoughts, those new communities coming through. So I believe in legal immigration. That's the second part of immigration. And the third part, you've got to face the music as to folks that came in illegally and have been here for a long period of time, and their children, by the way, who were born here in many cases or came here as very young adults. The DACA folks and the Dreamers, I think they should have a path to citizenship. I think that that is not only the right thing to do, but it's the only practical thing to do, because I can't really imagine, deporting 10+ million folks, especially those who came in really fleeing for a better life and who have contributed to our society. So those three planks, I think most of us can agree on. I think we can actually come up with a good, solid immigration reform if we get past the extreme party politics. I think that's a real challenge for us. Another area that is front and center to many, if not most Americans, is healthcare. Healthcare is a huge issue for our country, continues to be a huge issue for our country. Because although I think we have made strides towards broader coverage and more accessibility to quality health care for many throughout our country, it's unbelievable how many are still left behind. And these are folks that that are not only the ones that have not yet been able to gain any medical insurance, but those that are on the margins that maybe they have insurance, but it's so minimal and so expensive that for all intents and purposes, they don't have what most Americans have access to. And that's not acceptable. And there are a million drivers to that. And I think we need a major debate about whether our entire healthcare system is working, or whether we, which obviously it's not in many ways, but can we do this in a way that will actually work for many, many Americans? Two particular areas that I feel very strongly about. First of all, the protection of the prohibitions enacted in the last couple of years against discriminating against people with pre-existing conditions. So in other words, can an insurance company say no to covering me because I have diabetes? Can an insurance company say no to me because I have high blood sugar that is a precursor or an indicator to diabetes? Insurance companies were doing this, but the law says they can't now. And yet there have been efforts inside of Washington in recent years to repeal that incredibly important protection for so many Americans of not discriminating against folks with pre-existing conditions. We need to have everybody covered. And the folks that especially need health care, we need them to be especially covered by insurance. The other area in healthcare are incredibly high and still escalating cost of prescription drugs. It is outrageous that in our country we pay the highest for prescription drugs by far in the world, and this is just a national disgrace. It is a reflection of the next problem that I'll talk about, probably the best reflection of it. The influence of very, very large companies and very, very large money inside of our federal government, looking out for their interests and not the interests of the American people. There's a couple things that we can do about prescription drugs right away. The first we can do is to allow bulk purchasing in Medicare. Medicare is one of the largest, if not the largest, markets for prescription drugs in the world. And you would think that when you had a lot of folks participating, that you could negotiate with these drug companies to obtain a discount. So in other words, if I'm going to buy, 1,000 pills of something, I ought to be able to buy them for less per unit than if I just walked in and bought one of those pills. Yet that's not legal. Why is it not legal, you would ask? Because the drug companies have influenced that from a national policy, and I think that has to end. I think the other thing that has to end is a prohibition against prescription drugs being imported from other countries at prices substantially less. These are exactly the same drugs, okay? So there's no difference in quality. It's exactly the same drug, yet it sells in Canada for X price and, by multiples back in this country, but yet you can't import that from Canada. So obviously that's a captive market. That's not going to work. So if we can take care of those particular issues, we can start down the road of better coverage of health care throughout our country. I want to cover what I think and go back to what I think is really the largest single issue in our country. It's even bigger than the divide, although it causes a divide. And that is really what drove me back into government to start with. And that is fundamental reform in our campaign finance system and in our lobbying reform system, and in really taking government back for the people. Because the common concern, and I agree with it and I believe it in, is that Washington has really been captured by really insiders operating for their own interests as opposed to the public interest. And so much of this has to do with money in politics. For a generation now, we've had a pretty straightforward set of rules called McCain-Feingold, which basically says we're going to limit campaign contributions, and we're also going to require full disclosure. And in the last 10 years, 5 years, as a result of court cases and unfortunate laws, we've deviated from that so that nowadays, in many cases, contributions are unlimited and they are not disclosed. So we call that dark money, soft money. You can't trace where it came from. One of the major initiatives of this Congress, if not the major initiative, was H.R. 1. That was the first bill introduced into this Congress, and I was a co-introducer from the get-go on that bill. H.R. 1 aims at cleaning up government. H.R. 1, to me, is the single most important initiative that we can pass and enact in this current Congress. And I will do everything I can, together with my colleagues, to enact H.R. 1. I've talked about a lot of stuff in the last almost hour at this point, and our time is coming to an end. What I want to do now is to tell you that what's really, really important to me is staying in touch with you. I have a full office, great staff, both in Honolulu and here in Washington. We are completely devoted to answering your questions. We are completely devoted to helping you with your concerns and to listening to you. And we do so in a number of different ways. We welcome you to visit us in Washington and or in Honolulu. If you come to Washington, we're happy to show you around the Capitol. We're happy to arrange tours for you throughout Washington. And obviously we are accessible by e-newsletter and by email. But the most important thing you can do is to sign up for my e-newsletter. And the information on that should be on your screen throughout here. You can also reach me on my website. But if you sign up for my e-newsletter, I will send you an email every once in a while telling you what's going on, telling you what I'm working on, asking for your input on a particular issue. This is incredibly important to me to be able to stay in touch with you. We will find many, many other opportunities to stay in touch with you, and I look forward to reporting to you again from Washington and back home. Thank you for listening. Mahalo. Ed Case from Washington, D.C.